The South Shore of Lake Michigan doesn't invite you, it challenges you. It's a place where the raw truth of heavy industry looms like an ancient fortress. The smokestacks paint the horizon with gray plumes that mingle with the endless horizon, reminding you that this is the price of making a superpower. It's a sprawling expanse of steel mills, refineries, and factories all stitched together by a network of rail lines, and just beyond the din and smoke, Lake Michigan stretches out, vast, quiet, and impossibly blue. It's as if she's mocking industry's clamor with her serene indifference. Between the large mills and power plants stretch miles of pristine sand dunes protected in perpetuity. This is the South Shore, a place where the relentless hum of industry meets the eternal calm of the lake. It's a story that doesn't beg to be admired, only acknowledged.
We're almost a quarter of the way through another century, and Poppins and I are on our way to Whiting, Indiana to celebrate the new year at the Perogi Drop.
We're gonna ride along US 12, our nation's second interstate, and see what we can find.
And then we're gonna end that trip at Fort Dearborn, where the old Chicago road, where it ends. And I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. Let's go on an adventure. So on our intrepid adventure down Highway 12, we left off here at the Michigan-Indiana border. And you can check out that video, a 10,000-year-old trail that we did a couple months ago. But now we head that way through sand dunes and industry. Here in Michigan City at the Pierhead Lighthouse, they have one of the few remaining iron catwalks still in existence. From this harbor in Michigan City, you get to see a few things. You get to see a cooling tower from what looks like a nuclear power plant, but it isn't, and we'll get to that. You can see one of the few lighthouses that Indiana has, and if you look over there, you can see sand dunes that have quite a history. The first humans came to the South Shore of Lake Michigan right after the glaciers retreated about 14,000 years ago. Now, it doesn't look like they established any permanent settlements here, and that's because since the glaciers just retreated, there wasn't a lot of big vegetation or animals in the area. But there is evidence of at least seasonal settlements from about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence at certain sites point to the ancient Cane people being here about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And this nuclear power plant looking tower is actually part of a coal cooling tower. It cools the steam that's used to drive the turbine back into water so it can be reused by the power plant. And it's a rare sight for a coal-fired power plant. It's a hyperboloid tower. And the energy demands of the South Shore require a lot of energy. It kind of hints at the industry that we're about to pass through here on the South Shore. If you know anything about World's Fairs, they're kind of a big deal in the world. And Chicago had 2 of them, and they went all out. Since the mid-1800s, the world's had over 100 World's Fairs. They're not quite as popular as they once were. And the very first one was in 1791 in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And Chicago has had the honor of hosting 2 of those World's Fairs. Here in Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, you can see some of that World Fair history. In 1933, Chicago hosted the Century of Progress Exposition. The motto of that World's Fair was "Science finds, industry applies, and man conforms." Now, this exposition was in the middle of the Great Depression. The fair organizers hoped that it would boost the morale of the nation. The fair was held in Chicago's Burnham Park, and one of those exhibits was the 1933 Futuristic Homes of Tomorrow. And these homes were models of futuristic homes for the United States that included modern conveniences like appliances, modern furnaces, and modern design concepts.
So this home, designed by George Keck, included a dishwasher and laundry facilities. This is one of the 5 houses moved here to the Indiana Dunes shoreline.
One of the most famous houses was the Florida House, which was actually commissioned by the state of Florida. It was the only house that was state sponsored.
It was the most expensive and luxurious home that they built. It cost $15,000.
Now the walls were supposed to be poured concrete, but because they were going to remove it from the fair after the fair was over, they made it out of wood and stucco. And interestingly, a lot of boaters on Lake Michigan say that they use this pink thing for an aid to navigation while boating out on the lake. After the World's Fair, a developer bought the homes and then had them shipped here by barge so that he could add them to his development here. And this was the Armco Faro house, and it was designed to be mass-produced and affordable. And this is the Cypress log cabin. It was much different than the modern homes that were displayed during the exhibition, but this cabin was built out of cypress wood, which is often called the eternal wood, and that it lasts forever. And it was the only home in the World's Fair that somebody lived in during the fair. What I find interesting is with this exhibit, the Cypress cabin, they had on display a 100,000-year-old piece of cypress wood that was found under the Philadelphia subway. That's an old piece of wood. Today, these homes are private residences, so be respectful if you come to visit.
Once a year in September, they hold tours just for one day. The tickets go on sale in August and they sell out within an hour.
Now, if you wanted to live in one of these homes, I guess you can. You can buy a lease and spend about a few $1,000,000 in upkeep and repairs to certain historic standards. Over there, until the 50s and 60s, was like any other tourist destination on the South Shore. Beautiful rolling sand dunes. Highway 12 came through, which was a major tourist highway that took people to places like the lake shore so that they can enjoy the peace and the tranquility. But in the 50s and 60s, the South Shore started to change to what I've always felt, that this area was nothing but industry. In Burns Harbor is a piece of that industry. It's a steel plant built by Bethlehem Steel, today owned by U.S. Steel. It's a massive sprawling structure. Right in the middle is the port of Indiana, where stuff from all over the industry from the South Shore and other places is brought to ship out to other places in the Great Lakes and around the world. But this, not many years ago, was just a sand dune. But Burns Harbor until the 1960s was still one of those tourist destinations. It was still quite rural around here, with personalities like George Brad, whom the tourists called the old man of the sandhills. He was a Civil War veteran who led a solitary life for 30 years over in that area. Or a personality like Diana of the Dunes. Her real name was Alice,
who at 34 traded her life in Chicago for a life in the dunes.
But that beauty and those personalities all started to end in the 1950s. When Bethlehem Steel started buying up thousands of acres secretly through a company called the Lakeshore Development Company. And then Bethlehem Steel announced that they were going to build that steel plant. And there was fierce opposition from the state of Indiana and especially the locals in the area. And then in 1966, a political compromise was reached with Congress promising to create Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore to preserve the rest of the dunes in perpetuity. And with that compromise, they could build Bethlehem Steel's huge steel plant at Burns Harbor. And in the shadow of the Bethlehem Steel plant is the beauty of the sand dunes and some sort of architectural attempt to blend with the landscape, thanks to the National Park Service. So as you get into the Gary, Indiana area, you come to the southernmost point of Lake Michigan. Its longest part's 307 miles. Its maximum width is 118 miles. And at its deepest part, it's 923 feet. And everyone knows it's the only Great Lake that's entirely inside the United States. But not only can you visit that here, you can go down there to the Aquatorium. There's a lot of history there. Let's go check it out. So it was July of 1896 when Octave Chanute, who was a railroad engineer and I think an aviation enthusiast, performed a whole bunch of glider experiments here in the dunes. And he recorded all of the data that he gathered from those experiments. And in 1921, at the Gary Bathing Beach, this bathhouse was built. Chanute, who provided them. Now, Chanute made all of his data from those experiments available publicly, and he got a lot of publicity, so much publicity that it caught the attention of the Wright brothers. And they contacted Chanute and convinced him to become their mentor. And for a few years, he helped them develop their flying machine, allowed them to look at his glider designs, and provided his flight data for them. Hello, Poppins. And of course, as most of you know, that on December 17th of 1903, at Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina, in a freezing 27-mile-per-hour headwind, the Wright brothers flew their first powered aircraft called an airplane, and they flew 120 feet. Thanks, in large part, to Octave Chanute, who provided them with some priceless data. And Octave Chanute's memorial is here at this converted bathhouse, which was a popular destination from the 1920s to the 1950s, and it drew people from Chicago and Michigan here to use the beach and, I guess, to change their clothes here. But in the 1960s, this bathhouse fell into disrepair, and in 1971, it was closed to the public. But in 1991, this structure was rescued from demolition by the curiously named Society for the Restoration of the Gary Aquatorium and Octave Chanute's place in history. And apparently the society claims that they invented the word aquatorium, and I really couldn't find any information on the origin of the word except for the society's website. And in 1998, they began the conversion to a museum and an event space that you can rent. And the museum honors Chanute, Aviation, and the Tuskegee Airmen. And all that history is right here at the Chanute Aquatorium, if you look it up on Google Maps. It's kind of a nice little park. As we continue down Highway 12, we come to this, that some consider Chicago's oldest marker, but it's half in Indiana. This obelisk marks the border of Indiana and Illinois. And it was placed 191 feet that way in 1838. It is frickin' windy out and rainy. So in 1818, when Illinois became a state, the border of Indiana and Illinois was started. And the eastern border of Illinois came north along the Wabash River until it reached a certain point, and then it went due north straight to the shore of Lake Michigan. Wow. And when the survey reached this location in 1821, a large pine post was planted. Then it was later replaced by this 15.5-foot tall and 38,000-pound obelisk. But eventually it was lost to time over there between the railroad tracks when an executive of the power plant that used to be located through those gates noticed it, Alan J. Benson, and he decided to have it moved from there to here because it's a piece of history. We're 159.359 miles north of the Wabash River, and the border still goes through the middle of the obelisk. That's Indiana. And we're going to continue that way through Illinois to Chicago. And the weather is horrible. So we quite a while ago left Highway 12 because it goes out through the middle of Chicago. But back in the day, the old Chicago road actually followed the lake shores. So we're going to try to be more true to the original old Chicago road route and follow the lake shore through Chicago, and we enter the Chicago neighborhoods. Earlier, we mentioned the World's Fairs that happened in Chicago. And in 1893, the first one happened here in Jackson Park for the first time in the New World. The Ferris wheel was introduced here along with full-size reproductions of Christopher Columbus's ships. And for the first time, animal mechanics were demonstrated on a zoopraxiscope, a moving picture which wasn't very well known in 1893. The belly dance was introduced to North America for the first time. And that first Ferris wheel was 264 feet tall and can hold 2,100 people. And even the model of Spectacle Reef Lighthouse was displayed for the first time because that lighthouse was considered an engineering marvel. The list goes on, and honestly, you could spend months studying just the 1893 exposition and what was displayed there. That's the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry. It was the Fine Arts Palace during the Great Exposition, and that's the only building left on site from that exposition. And today you can see U-505, a German submarine, a life-size scale model of a coal mine. You could tour a 727 that's on display. You can see the Pioneer Zephyr, the first stainless steel passenger train. You can see the command module of Apollo 8 and a 3,500 square foot model railroad. It's really a great place to visit. But plan your trip because you have to have reservations to visit. Today it's closed because it's New Year's Eve day. But if you get a chance, it's an amazing museum. And you can see many of the structures left. This bridge has been closed that goes over. But you can tour the park too, where the exposition took place. And as you explore the park, you'll find features such as the Nazi Bridge. And those of you that are our age might remember the Nazi Bridge from the classic movie, The Blues Brothers, which Poppins kind of first saw for the first time a couple days ago.
It was amazing.
Very classic movie, but the Nazi Bridge, if you remember, Jake and Elwood were in the Bluesmobile and they wanted to cross the bridge. But on this bridge were the Illinois Nazis. But they're all standing here and there's protesters. Jake and Elwood were kind of like late and they had to get across the bridge. So Jake and Elwood just kind of punched it. And as Jake and Elwood raced across this bridge in the Bluesmobile, the Illinois Nazis had nowhere to go but over the edge and into the water. And of course, there's the replica of the Statue of the Republic. At the time, I think it was one of the biggest statues in the United States. This is just a replica that's 24 feet tall. Now, if you can imagine, the original was 65 feet tall, almost 3 times the size of the replica. And that's what you would have seen as soon as you entered the gates of the Columbian Exposition. That would have been kind of intimidating back in 1893.
5 miles from the site of the 1893 World's Fair is the Chicago's second World's Fair, which took place in 1933-1934. The only remaining artifact from the 1933 World's Fair is right here, this 21-year-old Roman column. It was given to the U.S. from Benito Mussolini, and it was here at the site of the Italian Pavilion during that World's Fair. It was given to the U.S. to celebrate the seaplanes that made it from Italy over here to the U.S. The 1933-34 World's Fair here in Chicago took place here on the mainland and also on Northerly Island. Let's go check that out. So we're here at Northerly Island, which is near Shed's Aquarium. Many people are familiar with that. It's really more of a peninsula. So many of you are familiar with Daniel Burnham. He is the architect who helped build the first skyscrapers here in Chicago in 1880. He was the chief architect for the 1893 World's Fair. So in 1909, Daniel Burnham published a book along with his partner about a plan for Chicago, about taking back the shoreline for the people and developing parks and building islands. Sadly though, Burnham passed away in 1912. His sons took over and they had a whole different vision for this northerly island. Herbert and Daniel took a way more modern look in building almost 24 structures here in a kaleidoscope of colors with sharp lines. It became known as the Art Deco design. So Walt Disney came to the 1933-34 World's Fair and was so inspired. Today, Disney World and Disneyland carry the magic of the World Fairs that had taken place right here. Standing here in this freezing rain, you can just imagine the nearly 24 buildings that were here, including the 5 houses that we saw on the Indiana Dunes shoreline. Today, this park is Viking and hiking and walking trails. There are no dogs allowed. So Daniel Burnham Sr.'s original plan has come to fruition since 2015's opening of this park.
About 15 years after the 1933 World's Fair, an airfield was built on Northerly Island, and it was called Meigs Field. And at one time, it became the busiest single runway airport in the world. And interestingly, in 1994, Mayor Daley of Chicago announced the closing of Meigs Field. And it closed in 1996, I believe, briefly, and due to political pressure by 1997, it was open again. But then in March of 2003, Mayor Daley ordered city crews to bulldoze large X's in the runway, essentially closing Meigs Field. And the FAA was upset, the federal government was upset, the state legislature was upset, but Meigs Field was gone for good. And today, Northerly Island, as Poppins mentioned, is a park. And in the 1830s, if you took the old Chicago Road from Detroit, you would have ended up in Chicago and the site of Fort Dearborn. It's a bit different today than it was back then. Today, Fort Dearborn is long gone, and in its place is the London House. And even though Fort Dearborn probably would have been busy for the 1830s, today it's crazy busy. So that little fort on the river became this, Chi-Town. And so ends the journey of the old Chicago Road. But we didn't come here for Fort Dearborn at the end of the road. We came here for the New Year's perogi drop in Whiting, Indiana. So let's go back. We are here in Whiting, Indiana for the perogi drop. It's right over there. It's rated 4th in the nation by USA Today, and it is not a big deal. So it's the perogi drop, and we got cheddar and potato pierogies, which I guess is a Polish dish, right? Mm-hmm. Apparently they have a tradition of that here, a pierogi drop, and then they have the pierogi festival.
Yep, in July.
And now we have a band playing that reminds me of my days of frequenting VFW halls.
Pierogi drop, polka, oh yeah, polka, oh yeah, oh yeah.
And that was the Perogi Drop 2024 into 2025. Happy New Year, y'all. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking.
Happy New Year.
Good luck in the new year.